listening to the Virtual CISO Podcast, providing the best insight on information security and security IT advice to business leaders everywhere.
Hey there, and welcome to yet another episode of the Virtual CISO Podcast. With you, as always, John Very, your host. And with me today, Jeff Schlauder. Hey, Jeff.
Hey, John. How are you?
I am doing good, sir. How about yourself?
Good. Yeah, I had a bourbon this morning, so I'm in pretty good shape.
You're just reminding me that I don't have a bourbon in my hand, Jeff. So we're off to a bad start. All right. Well, so now you led perfectly into the first question I typically ask. What's your drink of choice?
Red wine. Yeah.
A particular varietal or a blend?
Just a Malbec or a Cab, straight up.
My Malbecs are not my favorite. There's something to them, that sort of that licoricey flavor sometimes they have that I'm not crazy about. But I love a great Cab. In fact, I've been drinking. My father-in-law loves Cabs, but he only drinks 100% Cabernet Sauvignons. So and they have a little bit more chocolate, a little bit more coffee, a little bit more oomph. So I've been drinking the Cabs that I've been drinking recently are 100% Cab. Because as you know, what is it? Once you only need to be at 75 to call it a Cab or something like that.
Well, I try to stay under $15 as well. I forgot to mention that part. So
I do too. Most of mine are I mean, I'll go 20. If there's a bottle I want to try. But my everyday drinkers are usually in that $15 range, and you can find some nice Chilean 100% cabs.
Yeah, well, I'll hit you up for this.
12, 13. All right, I'll get it for you. It's my father-in-law. He's the smart guy. I'm just a follower. All right, so thanks for coming on. Wait, actually, I forgot to ask you the other question. What is it that you do every day? Sorry, man, I'm off my game today.
No problem. We started with bourbon, so I thought that was a better start. What do I do every day? I run a software company. So we, Catalina Worldwide, focus on building secure, enterprise level applications.
And full disclosure, we partnered with Jeff. Jeff has done some phenomenal work developing a GRC platform that he's been working with us extensively to customize for our use. I think he's one of the best development teams that I've ever worked with, and it's been a fantastic partnership so far. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
So what I want to chat about is, we've seen, such a high percentage of workloads and applications moving to the cloud over the last few years. And I think when you look at the major cloud platforms like the AWS and the Azure, there's a lot of complexity there. And we get a lot of questions about, how do you deploy a secure application in the cloud? And now specifically, you have a lot of expertise in AWS, and that's where you've helped us deploy a lot of our infrastructure. And we know that a high percentage of the breaches, what do they say, 90+% of breaches are because of people's misconfiguration of the cloud, not the cloud itself. So what I want to chat about today, and I always ask these really easy sounding questions that are almost impossible to answer, so apologies. But is there a simple framework that someone can use to design, deploy, and manage a web application in AWS?
No.
That was Jeff. Well, and thank you for listening to today's podcast. On our next podcast, we'll have a smarter guest.
So simple was kind of the key word there. I mean, I'm joking, right? Obviously, yeah. But there's multiple ways to deploy applications securely to the cloud, right? In this case, we are specifically in AWS. Designing a solution, there's not a lot of out of the box, right? Where, the easy button to just follow these 2 or 3 steps and you're going to be set. That's typically not what we see, and certainly wasn't how we got there. So there are a lot of it depends that come into play. But I can speak to, how we have found an efficient, scalable process, the types of things that we use, the tools, the practices to manage an environment to what we believe is a highly secure level.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think it depends is the right answer to 90% of security questions, right? Because if you don't understand context, then you can't answer a question. So, and I think understanding the what secure is and understanding an application context, right, is probably the first thing that you'd start with, and that would definitely go a long way towards beginning that process of figuring out, what that architecture is going to look like and what services you're going to be leveraging. Correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I mean, and there's not really one size fits all. So it's going to there's decision points there on who's going to be managing the infrastructure, what that support team looks like, their knowledge. There's a lot of really great tools and capabilities, as you know, within AWS, but they're not necessarily simple. So it takes time to build knowledge in each of those areas. So if at the end of the day, the team that's supporting the application and supporting the infrastructure doesn't have the knowledge necessary to manage it the way it was architected, that's probably the biggest security risk, right? Is while we typically say code and as being the primary vulnerability. In some cases, you can design and we've seen it happen, where you can design a really great secure solution, but it's so complex that a mistake or not understanding how everything interrelates can cause, just unnecessary risk and ultimately, security issues.
That's really interesting, and frankly, I hadn't thought of it in that exact context prior, and that speaks to there being a risk to the model many people use, because so many people outsource their development with the expectation that they're going to be managing it themselves once the development is done. But if the entity doing the development isn't thinking about it in the context that you just talked about, they're handing off an application that people, they're handing the keys over to a fighter jet, and these folks know how to drive a paddle boat.
Yep, I agree. I mean, it goes down to, even the most fundamental things of key management and rotation and where how you're managing the secrets and these types of things. So if you know that you're going to be deploying that application into an AWS environment, there's certainly services there that you would use out of the gate versus, building a portable container that may, deploy to multiple, either on-prem or multiple cloud platforms. So it really does depend.
Do you get into a situation where, let's say an organization has a very limited skill set, that you're going to hand this off to? You may end up in a situation where you're architecting to what they can support, but it's a compromised solution. So do you sometimes end up in a position where you pick the lowest possible common denominator, but it's got to be where they maybe have to up their game a little bit? Like that driving that paddle boat around isn't enough. You need to get to a 2-seat Cessna, and you're going to have to get them to upgrade their internal skill set, or the security and the usability or the efficiency and effectiveness of the application can be compromised a bit?
Yes. I mean, that is certainly a consideration. We've seen it happen. There are ways to, even for the lowest common denominator, to build a small web app, a single page app type of architecture in easy to manage solution like Lightsail. Doesn't require a lot of knowledge. It's not going to give you, the scalability for an enterprise, level global application, but has, built-in load balancer capabilities and networking. So there are ways to do that, to be able to hand it off to somebody who really doesn't have a comprehensive knowledge of how AWS services work and interrelate. But yeah, in most cases, deciding when we start, building an application, what the vision is. So where is it going to be used? Does it need to be? Are we going to go down the containerization road, which I would say, 95% of the time the answer is yes. Where do they, how many are we deploying and having to support, Google Cloud as well as, AWS and Azure, and what's the, and on-prem solutions. So some of these things, not necessarily for the code itself, but the whole process. So when we build an application, we're looking at it from the actual lines of code to the pipelines that need to be built, the deployment process, the code reviewing, just kind of soup to nuts, the entire process, and then trying to understand what pieces we're responsible for and what the customer wants to take responsibility for.
Yeah, do you find that your approach, and you took that approach with us, right? Like when we asked you, we came to you and we said, hey, we want to do this, you came back with numbers that were high, and I was like, wow, this is, and you were like, well, no, look, who is going to be responsible? It's one thing to build something. It's another thing to operate it, maintain it. Right. So, I mean, you're thinking full life cycle, which I think, was eye-opening to me and something that I was appreciative once I understood it. Do you think that's, I mean, it seems to me like all too often you hear like there's a differentiation between building it and operating it. And that's part of that place where people can get themselves in trouble.
Yeah. And I think that, there's a common misperception that just having somebody build it and then you'll run it will somehow, end up with a, more secure application or less cost, and that just typically in our experience isn't the case. If I'm building an application and handing that off kind of as a one-time deal and providing it to the company, I'm going to charge more out of the gate, hands down. But what I would charge at that point may be the same as operating it for 2 or 3 years, right, combined together. Because we would design it in a way that we look at it as like a paved road approach. If we're going to build this and we're going to manage it, we're going to build it using the technologies that we're comfortable with, that we have, not just experience in, but are kind of industry best practices. When we start introducing customizations or unsure of, the full life cycle of the application from development to, full production maturity, it introduces, risk. So we start getting a little bit more gravel on the road and a little bit more, each customization brings risk with it. So our approach of following kind of our paved road of here's what we do, and if we do it this way, it may end up being less expensive to build it and operate it than it would be to take a set of requirements from a customer and build from scratch and hand that back off. That's kind of how we look at it. So us truly understanding what the goal is, and do we have do we want to develop the relationship where we're part of, the operationalized, fully deployed application or not?
Yeah, so I like the way you said, what the goals are, what are the objectives. So so I'm imagining the business requirements, I'm imagining their technical requirements, I'm imagining the types of data, risk. What are some of the inputs that you're typically looking at, so that way you can make a good determination on, make on these decisions that you're making, right?
Yeah, some of our, certainly there's one design, kind of architectural approach for a mom and pop, e-commerce type of solution that has been done 100 times versus an enterprise level global application, and trying to understand the compliance frameworks that are in scope, the customer's broader exposure. If it's global, those are certainly considerations. And it's not that we would build it differently, it's the rigor that goes into the process along the way. So where we're automating certain gates versus having manual gates. So you don't have to build a pipeline and automate everything from beginning to end in every case. That may not be the right answer. And actually, even in the way that we manage most of our infrastructure, we don't automate everything. Not that we couldn't, but we and even where we have, we stop and we have gating criteria that allows us to really feel comfortable moving forward is the right thing to do versus just pushing a button, deploying code, and kind of running with that.
They just become like sort of sanity checks in the middle of a process, right? Get some human eyeballs on something just to make sure that yes, this is going the way that we're anticipating it's going.
Right, or insanity, just to confirm that we are truly still not crossing over into sanity. That too,
Yeah. It's, for some reason, I just had a Shining a reference come into my head, but I won't go there. A quick question for you, because you mentioned it, and I think it's one of those topics that people now are more and more familiar with the concept of containerization, but I don't think they fully understand it. So, like, if you were looking at an application, what would make you decide to have something be containerized versus not containerized?
It's a good question. If we're taking our approach of how we manage our process, we would containerize it because we have a lot more. There's automation, as I mentioned, but we have visibility earlier on into risks or vulnerabilities, OS-related, challenges that may present after the code has been deployed to, let's say, an EC2 instance. So when we think about, for us, and everybody has their own opinion on this, right? It's like bacon. Everybody has their own way that they like it, and some folks think, just not using containers, it introduces some complexity. Not everybody's familiar with it. EC2 is kind of very straightforward, but the way that we're going to, the way we do it, large percentage of the time is to containerize to get uniformity, to get a consistent product, to get early on indicators of something that's not right, to automate, vulnerability management, these types of things that are much easier to do, and just from a scalability perspective.
Is it that when you containerize your infrastructure becomes code, and it's easier to look at, like you said, because you can workflow automate anything, right?
Sure.
So what you're saying though is that in that automation process, I'm going to have visibility into the net configuration of my entire deployment, as opposed to getting serial output associated with my code, with my third-party libraries, than with my actual instances that have been deployed in EC2.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And some of the features, when you look at AWS and their ECR container registry capability, I think there's, and one of the other misconceptions is that containers are more complicated. So I think that it's not necessarily easier than not on the initial setup, but once you have a process in place for how you're going to build them, the deployment, the management, the visibility into what's actually going to be in production and how it's going to run. When you think about things like, being able to roll back, to manage, the scalability of it. It's actually more difficult to do that when you're not in a container than when you are. So I think the upfront of somebody trying to get their head around what choice should I make here, to talk with somebody who has has their head around it, I guess is probably a good way to put it, to explain it, the benefits of it, but then to operationally see what that really means. Like, let's go look at ECR and see, now that you have your container registered, what capabilities does that give you within AWS that you wouldn't otherwise have? And I think that's probably how we like to approach it.
Right. And I know that in our work together, you rebuild our Oscar environment weekly. and that's done through containers, right? So, and I'm a little bit ignorant of containers, so my assumption is that what you're doing is you're building a new container, you're testing it, it's going through your pipeline, and when it's ready, you're pushing that into our environment. I'm assuming that our old container stays around long enough that you keep that there in case we need it to roll back. And what we've done is we've separated the data from the compute infrastructure and functionality. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep. And they can sit in the registry. I mean, so you actually have your version control, you have your whole history there. So yes, certainly rolling back, but for a lot of other reasons to keep those around.
So is ECR, I'm not familiar with ECR as a user, is ECR almost like a version control, like Git for containers, right? I mean, it's because I guess in a sense, right, a container is nothing but code, right? And and you're just managing instances of code, versions of code, right?
You are, yeah. I mean, that you could look at it that way.
I mean, I'm sure there's more to it, but from a simplified perspective.
Yeah, it is. That's a good way to view it.
Okay. And one last question, just and curiosity. Would the reason that you would choose Kubernetes instead of ECS be that you want the containers that you build to be operational, somewhere else? Like why ECS versus Kubernetes is the I guess the fundamental question.
Yeah, there's whole people are very passionate about EKS,
Okay.
and certainly I think there's a few reasons. If it really depends on who's going to be managing it. There's no doubt that in my mind anyway, and based on our experience, that ECS is easier to wrap your head around. It is easier meaning it's easier to learn, it's easier to kind of manage. EKS is just a bigger beast, right? It certainly is. The payoff is there if you have the knowledge and understand Kubernetes and need that level of visibility, portability. If you see yourself building, your clusters in AWS with your containers, and you want to move your entire cluster out of AWS, not that we would want anybody to do that, but if that were to happen, then yeah, you could do that with EKS, and you could move that to another. Whereas with ECS is AWS, product. So you're still talking about building, a cluster and deploying your containers there, but being able to take that entire cluster, and I really don't have use cases of where somebody would do it, but wanting to move that cluster from ECS over into, GCP would not be an option for you.
Right, because the container contains AWS specific elements, correct?
ECS does, correct. Yeah, but
Okay.
with that comes some, not some, quite a bit of simplicity of using and leveraging their services, like tying into IAM and just other things that you don't have to have a comprehensive understanding of each individual service to feel like you understand ECS itself.
Gotcha. And then, so if somebody let's say that somebody's got a team and they're talking about migrating an app, and let's say they're not working with an outside group like yourself. What type of resources should they be looking for? What experience are there particular? Like, if I'm the CEO of an organization and my team is saying, hey, we're moving this critical application of ours to Amazon, and I'm a little bit nervous, what should I be looking for? How would I know if they've got the chops to do it?
Well, I mean, there's AWS has all types of levels of certification that you can get. Also, AWS certified developers, and so there's just a myriad of certifications that you could rely on to say this person at least understands and isn't, it's not smoke and mirrors. They do understand AWS. They understand, from a development perspective, how to leverage those services. Not just how to develop code, but how that development of that code and that process should look as it relates to AWS specifically. So I would say that is a great place to start, is to, look at the individuals currently on your team. It takes time, so it's not a quick video or Udemy that you're going to be able to plow through and become an AWS certified developer. There's a bit to it, and it's pretty time intensive.
And the person who, so that gives you the awareness of the tools that are available to you, and it helps you in selecting the right tools within their environment, right products within their environment. Yeah. Would that be usually the same person that is one of your developers, or do you find that call it cloud architect role is a different role than a traditional, I don't even know the right words these days, coder, old school coder that's sitting in your actual application code?
Definitely different. So I mean, the developer certification and what we found there is, we put our own folks through it, so it's important to us. When you're talking about doing architecture, and the folks that are have the certifications, at that level, that's a different skill set. But there's a lot of crossover, right? If you're working with your architect, they're also likely contributing to the building of pipelines, and trying to, they're trying to understand and may have less visibility into what the application actually does. But so when they're laying out an architecture, they're going to have some knowledge there of what this thing's going to do at the end of the day. And then I think that helps everybody collectively choose the right services. So they may have, decision points on the when they're laying out the architecture, that information around the application itself would be is a critical input, right, to making the right architectural decision. So like I mentioned, light sail, right? You won't find an AWS architect who's going to likely say the right place to build and deploy your app is in light sail. It exists for somebody who's probably not going to be working with an architect to design it from beginning to end. So I mean, yes, they're definitely two different certifications, two different people. In my experience, I haven't found one that does both of those.
Gotcha. And the people that are coding the app itself, right? Does coding is it completely transparent if I'm running this on-prem servers versus, is code no matter where it is, or is there considerations that when you're actually coding the application, that knowing it's in Amazon, you're going to do things a bit differently?
Yeah, there are. I mean, it is not, I mean, like I mentioned in the beginning, around how are you going to handle things like managing secrets and keys and config files. So some of that, yes, if you were doing an on-prem, kind of building your own server, installing your own node and database and whatever UI you're going to use, having to manage the configuration of the connection strings, these types of things would definitely be different. And if you knew you were going to AWS, you would one, it simplifies it, to be honest, and it takes a lot of the risk out of the solution, because those services have been evaluated, certified, all the way up through different IL levels, impact levels, across different compliance frameworks. So the way that, as an example, S3 buckets are configured, you really don't have to do much there to try to wrap your head around what S3 is doing. Where you're going to store your secrets is in Secrets Manager. So you don't, if you're not using something like AWS and you're developing a service like AWS Secrets Manager, and you're developing an application, that's certainly a critical, input into how are you going to manage this, right? Where are these going to be stored? How are they going to be retrieved? How often are they going to be rotated? And then how are you going to manage the application uptime while all that's occurring?
Cool. You talked a little bit about pipelines and automation. I think we beat that up pretty good. That's, one layer in there, I guess, just to touch on briefly, is, the automation is how you deploy applications, right? But it's also how you validate their security through that. What are the typical things that you guys are leveraging in terms of ensuring the security through the pipeline?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's a lot of opinions. Everybody has their favorite tools, so we'll start there. I can mention specific tools. We use GitLab, for our, for our pipelines, for our repository, and we've used other tools along the way. For us, we use, again, GitLab is just it does some really great things, but it does have some challenges as well. So I think that when we start layering on what it does well, and then trying to fill some of what we think are complementary services or holes that, where an additional tool would be beneficial, we like code reviews as an example. It doesn't matter really what you do within, if your developers are developing code, committing that code to the repository, the process from that point of getting that commit to what happens to when it goes into production is what we spend a lot of time on. Even down to the developer's local workstation and them having the tools to catch those vulnerabilities, to the typical OWASP code quality type of issues locally, and to even have that scanned locally before their commit is received in the repository. So we spend a lot of time on the development process from code generation through deployment. And while I say GitLab is our primary solution there, we have other tools that we use that in some cases do a more comprehensive, in our opinion, more comprehensive job earlier on in the process. Again, down to the actual developer's workstation, where we can catch things earlier.
So would it be fair to say that if you do a good job in the pipeline, that you can be reasonably well assured that you're deploying something which is secure, at least from a known, like we can always be exposed to 0 days, but from anything beyond a 0 day, we can be reasonably sure that we're deploying an application which is highly secure.
Yes, if you're using the right services and using pipelines which automate that. So as an example, if you're doing your local, code validation, that's being committed to the repository. On that commit, containers being built. So basically, an image is being built. That image is submitted to the code repository, so to ECR. At that point, it automatically gets scanned. So we get a lot of visibility from the time the code is committed to the rest of the process. And again, we're talking a minute, not hours, to have a reasonable assurance at that point that at least the code and the image itself is passing those checks. Now, the ECR is not going to scan all of the code. That's not what it does for code quality. That's what we use other tools for. But yes, if you've made it through that process, at least our process, you have a very high, in our opinion, assurance level that you're in good shape.
Gotcha. So we if you think about it, we started at how do we get the information that we need to architect a secure application? Now we've talked about how do we end up deploying a secure application. So now we got the application out there. And I'm very proud of what you've helped us do, that whenever I go into AWS Security Hub, that our security score is 100 usually. I saw it dip to 98 because someone hadn't logged in 90 days, but we fixed that. And that's funny that somebody hasn't used a credential in 90 days, maybe you should disable the credential. We actually lost points. So, so let's talk a little bit about how do we keep that application secure? How do we ensure that it stays secure? Right? How do we monitor that? Talk a little bit about how you've helped us do that, because I think what we've done is really good.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. When we're talking about kind of up to this point around, decisions around containerization, then getting into how that code is managed, where it's the repository and what happens at that stage, being picked up or being pushed out or referenced from the repository into ECS or EKS, where it's run. I think when we kind of look at that full circle, that's a point in time. So if you're doing that and you're doing that once a month or once every couple months, just by time passing, you start increasing risk. So I think the first piece of that, John, is really the frequency. And for us, we're an agile shop, as most folks are nowadays, but we're deploying typically once a week. So we're going through that entire process now throughout the 6 days in between deployments there. We know that what the fresh image looks like. We know everything will be rebuilt. We feel really good about what's going out 7 days from now, every step of the way. When it's finally deployed and in production, using things like config, security hub, which provides visibility into those types of things. So not the common, is there a code vulnerability, but is S3 set up correctly? Are these buckets publicly exposed? You mentioned, hadn't logged in, or is there MFA or access keys that aren't being rotated? So keeping up with that, some of it can be automated, but it just takes, some of it is one and done, but there are just, probably 20% of it that just requires somebody to pay attention to it. And it unfortunately, some of those things that are typically not automated are the ones that introduce the most risk. So if you set your S3 buckets as an example to private, by default, that's going to happen every step of the way. But as these users start to, either a new user gets added and no MFA is enabled at that time, or things aren't rotated or people aren't using those accounts, that can introduce risk. But it just takes ongoing management of the overall environment, not just the code and the containers, the infrastructure, but also the operational pieces of it.
Right. And then there's the other part that we do, and it's great that you can do, is you can set it so that not only are we provably secure, but we're provably compliant. So I think in our environment, what have we enabled? I think it's PCI. We've enabled AWS Security Essentials, and what was the other one we have?
CIS.
Enabled?
It has a CIS.
The CIS benchmarks, right?
Yeah.
So that's also a really nice way of kind of ensuring that you've got a high security posture, right? Is enabling one or more. So A, that helps from a security perspective if you're choosing good frameworks, but B, that also helps from a compliance perspective, right? Where you can demonstrate to auditors, regulators, key third parties that you're doing things right.
It certainly makes it a lot easier. It makes it a much easier, cleaner narrative when you can actually show the artifacts and it's in the services that you're using, not having to go.
Yeah, I know that when our customers ask about it, I'm like, here's a screenshot from yesterday, when they see 100 score in AWS Secure, anyone who uses Security Hub knows that it's not easy to maintain a 100.
It's not, and for some folks, 100 is not the right answer. AWS is in it to, they're not a nonprofit. Let's put it that way. So some of the default rules that will be there, like you should replicate all of your, S3 buckets to another availability zone or region. There's some of the things just inherently are going to have cost to them. But that's an availability type of, concern or risk. So if that's not something that you're, overly concerned about, those are, more business. There are some business decisions to be made around, is the right thing to do to get to 100%, or are some of these rules just not appropriate for our business? They should be disabled with a business justification of why, and go from there.
Yeah, same thing with the Microsoft Security Center. If you're in, like, we're an E5 shop. Yeah, you go into Microsoft Security sometimes and you look at and you're like, yeah, I don't think we really need to worry about doing that particular thing. Oh yeah, by the way, that would cost us, X dollars per month per employee to enable for no real reason.
Yeah, it would be a nice feature if in there they had an estimated, bill, next month's bill next to each of the.
That would just make it too obvious what they were trying to do, though, Jeff. I mean, you can't make, that would be like, a consulting firm coming in and saying, hey, we found this really significant issue, and here's how much we'll charge to actually fix that issue. I mean, it just makes it just a little bit too much of too much tie there, so to speak.
Yeah.
All right, so we beat this up pretty good. Anything we miss? Last thoughts?
No, I mean, I think, probably last thought is around we talked about development practices, but really through all of this, if, what I mentioned, we put a lot of time into from code development to deployment. But that's, and it's kind of sounds old school, but the segregation of duties there, right? That peer review, that development team, we have found to be kind of the most critical piece. So having those peer reviews, because again, it doesn't matter how great the vulnerability management tools are, the value of having a second set of eyes, not just on is this a vulnerability, but is it the right thing to be doing, right? Is it the right approach? Is it scalable? Does it kind of go outside of the parameters of our paved road and the direction we want to go? Ease of use, right? As I mentioned, each time you bring in something custom, you bring in, in our opinion, risks, support issues, these potential tech debt down the road. So other than, tooling and automating and managing vulnerabilities, sometimes the vulnerability is just, the person themselves, and not maliciously, just inadvertently. So if you have, that additional ability, and not everybody does, where you can put that gate in and have somebody, truly look at how something was done, not if it's secure or not. I think that is, to us, that's a big part of it.
So you're talking like a literal old school code walkthrough.
Yeah, I am.
So that's really interesting to me that you say that. So if I took a SaaS tool, right, and I run it against code, from a security perspective, I think that would catch the vast majority of things. Maybe what it would miss would be logic errors or something of that nature. So like, I'm just wondering, like, when you think about the value of code walkthrough, because I think a lot of people bypass that. I don't think there's as much code walkthrough going on as, since we've got these automated tools as there used to be back in the old days when I was in application development. So the question becomes is, how often will I catch a security error versus how often am I catching these other errors, types of errors that or not errors, but non-optimal coding techniques or non-optimal technology leveraging? What percentage will I find in one versus another? Will I find true security vulnerabilities through code walkthroughs that the tools will miss?
Not typically.
Okay.
Not typically. To be honest, you just typically won't. I mean, the tools do a really good job, not just on the security piece, but even just how things are. If you're declaring a variable, and then you're not using that, it'll even flag that. Our tools will, and just say, hey, this isn't necessarily a vulnerability at this point, but it's just not being used. It's sloppy, right? So
yeah, you're not deallocating this memory over here.
Right.
That's not going to be a bug, but your code's going to run better if you do.
And it's just, or something wasn't closed correctly, or so these types of things that may not be security issues, but it's more of the approach. Did you solve this problem? Is this code that we just developed that passed all of our code quality checks good code? The answer is yes, right? We've determined that through our process. We feel really good that the code is good, but is it the right approach to have solved the issue? And that's the piece that can sometimes be overlooked without a peer review. To say, I get how we did this, but what we did was we did it in the UI, and we solved the problem in the UI instead of the API. So what we would like to do in our approach of simplicity and ultimately security is do as much on the API side as we can. If we're going to get there either way. It's not going to be flagged either way, but it just could have been done differently.
Right. And technically that could be doing any type of validation in the browser is not a good idea and could be theoretically a security issue.
Yeah, it can just be things where, if you think about the basics of an application, where are the items coming from in the select box that you're using? Are those, stored in the UI? Are they being pulled from a database? Is it being retrieved from an API call? So either way, you can do it. You're not going to get a vulnerability by building a list of 8 select box items in the UI, but it's not supportable, right? It's not the right.
But you could theoretically, I guess the only thing is that if somebody manipulated that using a tool like Burp, right, some type of proxy, if you're not capturing, if you don't have some type of input validation in the API, in theory something could go wrong, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it cascades from there. So I think just bringing that back is we haven't given up on doing peer reviews. We think
I think it's great that you do, and I think, like you said, you're writing more elegant code, writing more efficient code, writing code which is better aligned with the business objectives, right? That's what you're going to. I could see you clearly could get through a code walkthrough that the tools would have no way of doing.
Right. Yep, and where we use JavaScript framework, so there's all kinds of things that you can do within that other frameworks like a Go or are a lot more rigid and aren't going to let you make some of the have as much flexibility or maybe make some choices you wouldn't otherwise have the option to make.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So hopefully you prepared for this question. Your eyes are probably scanning the document now. What questions are you about to ask me? I'm gonna give you the question. Give me a fictional character or real world person you think would make an amazing or a horrible CISO, and why.
Fictional character.
He didn't prepare, folks. He did not prepare.
I didn't prepare for this one.
Jeff, you were doing so well. You were doing so well up to this point.
This is going to be.
This will haunt you as you go to sleep tonight.
Well, let me flip it back. How about you give me one first here? Let's turn this around.
Oh, well, no, listen. I'm sorry. Whose name is on the show? I'm the star, right? You're at best today. You're a guest star, co-star, something of that nature.
So being put on the spot, not even being able to name a fictional character.
Being put on the spot. I sent you this agenda earlier in the week.
You give me the character.
Don't say I put you on the spot.
You give me the character. I'll tell you why they're good or bad.
Let's give a character. Niles Frazier.
Niles Frazier.
The TV show Frasier?
Yeah, I shouldn't have given you that.
I gave you a character. How about give me a TV show or movie that you love that I might know.
Walking Dead.
Never watched it.
Law and Order.
No, don't watch it.
Oh my goodness.
How about Community? You ever watch Community?
No,
man. You and I don't have the same TV taste. Breaking Bad.
No, don't watch it.
West Wing.
No, it's not up my alley.
Wow.
Yeah.
Sopranos.
Yep, let's do it.
All right, there you go. Paulie Walnuts.
Oh my goodness. These are so. I should have prepared for this question. I would have had my answer all lined up. I think, and this is going to mess up your whole segment here. I think the root of the question is what makes a good CISO?
No. The root of the question is we want to be entertaining, Yeah. And I think me busting your chops worked. So I think mercifully we're gonna let you off there. I think that this is the entertaining part of the show, and me roasting you is pretty entertaining, at least to me. Hopefully the audience.
I was gonna pull out Elon Musk there at the end, but I'm not. I'm just leaving it go now.
Too late.
That's fair.
All right. So if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way to do that?
Probably email. Actually, my mobile phone's probably the best way to get in touch with me. I get a lot of email.
You sure you want to put your mobile phone number on the internet?
It's a catch-22 because of
How about
email. Let's do it. Let's do email.
LinkedIn? All right, LinkedIn?
No.
All right. So what would be the email address?
It's J Schlauder, SCHLAUDER at CatalinaWorldwide.com.
Cool. All right. Despite your horrible performance on my last question, this was pretty damn good. So I wanted to say thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.